Hey folks, welcome to Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. Let's compost all the wrong stuff. So all of these gardens you see here, and all of the pots that I grow every year, all of my trees, my fig trees, and anything that I grow in a container needs fertilization, needs healthy soil, needs compost. And well, I need to make that myself, because I don't trust the outside sources like I've said in so many videos. But that's a lot of compost. I've got to make a ton of this stuff, and therefore I've got to be creative sometimes in the materials I put in my compost bins. What can you put in compost? What can you not put in compost? We're going to talk about some of that today, and we're going to break some rules while we do it. So we're talking about hot composting when we're speaking of a compost pile. Generally, you're hot composting. And the whole purpose of hot compost is to heat up enough where the bacteria that's doing the work for you survives, but they're the ones that put off the heat. But the diseases in your plants that might be there, the weed seeds and all that stuff that gets in your compost, you want to kill it, and the heat will do that job for you. So that's why we layer greens and browns. When we talk about greens and browns, nitrogens and carbons, we're talking about the two major components of compost that the bacteria need to break down efficiently. So greens are going to be your green leafy materials like grass clippings, coffee grounds are high in nitrogen. Anything high in nitrogen that's green and leafy or that you know has a high nitrogen content. Browns are going to be your carbons like paper products, cardboard, dried leaves. What happens to plant material when it dies is it gives up all the liquid and all the chlorophyll and all of that, all the stuff inside those cell walls dries up and leaves behind the cellulose, and that's just brown carbon-based material. So sticks, woody products, paper products, these are your browns. Usually composting, people who compost find that they have a difficult time finding enough carbon for their compost pile. So that's why I like to use shredded paper and cardboard, things like that. They say the ratio you should aim for is well, they say 30 to 1, 30 carbon to 1 nitrogen. That's crazy. Other people say no, you should even it out and have half and half. I don't worry about that. I just make sure I have a mix going in. And when I have a mix going in, I usually get a nice hot pile. The whole idea of hot composting is that the heat is generated inside the pile. And normally, even if it's sub-freezing weather out there, well, that will hamper the action because it will, if it penetrates that pile, it'll kill off your bacteria. But generally, you can get a good compost pile going even in the winter, and in the middle of your pile, it'll be hot. In fact, it's about 50 to 55 degrees here, which is cool. It's not cold, but it's certainly cooler than it was in the summertime. Let's go see if there's any heat in my compost pile. Yes, lots of steam. It's hot down in there. That's some hot compost. And you can see in here there's a lot of grass clippings, there's a lot of leaves, there's a lot of eggshells and kitchen scraps in here. But I've also added some other good stuff to this compost pile to help it to heat up. Let's talk about what you can do if you stall your compost pile and you really want it to heat up. Sometimes you might stall your compost by having an imbalance in materials. Right now I've got a lot of egg carton crates in here, and I get these from my son who works in a restaurant. These are high carbon material. They're basically wood pulp. I have tons of them. I put cardboard pizza boxes in here. That's carbon material as well. Paper shredded paper, also that's carbon as well. Sticks like this, high carbon material. If you get an imbalance and you go too far to one side and you don't have enough nitrogen, or if you've got too much nitrogen and not enough carbon, you can jumpstart the process by adding sugars. I had in this bucket at one time some molasses, some granulated agricultural molasses. Well, the bucket got a crack in it, and over about a year's time, this bucket filled with water, and that sugar in there fermented. Well, I took this and hosed it out and I dumped it in here. It was pretty full. And I dumped it in here. And all that sugar was watered down really well into my compost, and that helped kickstart this pile, which was imbalanced toward carbon. I had a lot of wood chips and mulch down in the bottom of this. Well, once that got going, I stirred it up really well, and this pile has been churning away now for about a week, and it has reduced. It was about up to there. It's reduced down about 8 inches now. So yeah, this is a really hot pile, and I kick-started it with sugar. What if you don't have molasses? Well, you can use any sugary substance, old syrup that you might have laying around. I've seen people use soda. Literally, take a couple of liters of soda and just pour it all over your compost pile and then water it in. And the sugars in that soda will cause a bacterial bloom down in there. Now, most of the bacteria is eating that sugar, but once they run out of sugar, you have a very high population that will last a few days, maybe a week, and will work on your compost until it dies out again. But you can get a little bit of a boost using sugars like that. We're gonna put some things in the compost pile today that are rule breakers. Expired chicken stock, straight in there. Expired buttermilk. They say, oh, you can't compost dairy? Sure you can, why not? More expired buttermilk. The reason most people say you can't compost something has nothing to do with making compost and more to do with offending your neighbors or offending you with smell. But you can mitigate smell in a compost pile fairly simply by keeping it active. I have here some moldy cow cheese. Again, dairy, moldy cheese. Some old chicken nuggets. Hey, you can't compost meat. That's going to attract vermin. Maybe a little bit. It might attract some rats, might attract an opossum, but they're just going to dig around in my compost pile, turn it around a bit for me, and leave their deposits behind. And so yeah, you can compost meat just fine. Meat's high in nitrogen. Meat's a good addition to your compost pile. If you're worried about the smell, bury it in the middle of the compost pile. I'm going to turn this in when we're done and get that stuff buried down quite deep. It'll still attract a few rats, but they'll just eat a little bit. Meat, yeah, it's good for your compost pile. Leftover chicken that's gone bad. Salsa and all. A big hunk of steak that got overdone. Straight in there. This guacamole's seen better days. That's gnarly, huh? It's turning. Some expired Greek yogurt that's out of date. There's some probiotic life already going on in this stuff, which will be helpful for your compost pile as well. Don't waste good stuff. Limp celery, limp carrots, all of that goes in there. Now, that vegetable material will attract just as many vermin as throwing dog food or steak or chicken nuggets in here. My opossums that come around every night, they love to eat some of the vegetable material out of my garden or out of my compost pile. But I'll turn it in and mix this up real well, and hopefully we won't attract too many vermin. But if we do, like I said, they're just doing their job. Okay, so we've buried all that stuff now in our compost pile. That should keep any smell down, and any smell that comes around, it's just going to last a day or two. And you won't even notice it unless you get right up next to it. That's good stuff. That's going to make good compost. All of this stuff right here, this is the biomass from my garden, my summer garden. Lots of good brown material in here. All of this could go into the compost pile. There's a problem with this though. Check this out. See this stuff right here? These are seed pods, and they're morning glory seed pods. And see all those seeds in there? Now you could put this in your compost pile and hope that the heat will kill off those seeds, but I'm not going to risk it. I had a question about whether you should really bother with putting diseased plants or pests, plants that you've had pests on. I would even extend that to plants that have lots of weed seeds in it, like this stuff here. Can you put that in your compost? Does it really matter? After all this stuff is out there in the environment to begin with. It's in nature, it's all around us. But I just don't like to risk concentrating this in my compost pile when I don't have a consistent hot pile as much as I'd like. I'd rather not put it all in there, but I will compost it. I will compost this in other ways. So if I have a bunch of plant material that has those weeds in there and you can't separate that stuff out, then I don't put it in my compost pile. Even if I'm hot composting, I don't want to run that risk. Some people will say, no, go ahead and put it in there. Some weeds you can put in there. They make it through just fine. The problem with weeds is that once you see them and once you realize they're there and they're big enough to throw in your compost pile, usually they've gone to seed. And that's just a problem. I don't compost those in my hot compost bin. I do compost them though. I'll show you how. This is compost tea, but it's an anaerobic compost tea. This would be called Dave's Fetid Swamp Water. I learned about this from David the Good, who's practicing this method after studying, well, he'd been doing it before, but this is a very powerful type of composting in which you can take your weeds and all that noxious stuff, stick it in a bucket of water, the bigger the better, and let it sit there and brew and get nasty. I've put shrimp heads, fish, chicken bones, and all my weeds, the weeds that I won't put in my regular compost bin, go in here, and I stuff them down in there and let them brew and rot. And this is a constant, I refill it with water if I need to. It stinks really, really bad. And this is an anaerobic brew. You wouldn't want to eat anything with this stuff on it unless it's been allowed to, to sit in the garden for about a week or two. And this is actually really good fertilizer. And the reason it's so nutritious is that when you put all your noxious weeds and all that stuff in your bucket that you can't put in your regular compost pile, all the work those weeds did to bring up nutrients and store them in their biomass, you can get that back. Those weeds can be placed in here, they rot down, the seeds rot down, everything in there is not viable anymore, and you're just taking the liquid leftovers, and all of that nutrition that the weeds have robbed from your garden, you put it right back by using this stuff to water your garden with. So you don't want, like I said, you don't want to eat stuff that's been fertilized with this Dave's Fetid Swamp Water right away. You want to give it time to break down in the air to kill off the anaerobic bacteria. I'd give it a week or two and then wash it really good. But it's good stuff, good fertilizer. Cultures have been using this method for centuries, and it's good, really, really good. So you don't have to have a container at all to do some kinds of composting. You can just pile everything up on the ground. Right behind me here, I'm composting in place. A lot of these weeds, and those are some eggplant plants right there, they're covered in some of that weed that I don't want to put in my garden. And so I just drop them around the base of these trees here that I want to feed. And over time, that will break down. I kind of let this area go weedy and bushy here. This is a jungle back here that my dog and my kids like. So yeah, Samuel used to play on this. He's a little bit too big for that now, but we got into the tradition of letting this be our jungle. So it makes sense for me that I can just drop stuff on the ground back here and I don't have to worry about it, just compost in place. You can do that around fruit trees, you can do that around larger plants. You can just, it's called chop and drop, and you just let things compost in place, just like the forest floor. And that stuff will biodegrade and work its way into the soil and feed that plant. Here's another method of composting in place. These are my muscadine grapevines, and they grow and their roots tend to follow the vines up and down this wire that I have. So when I cut my grass, oftentimes I'll just dump it underneath my vines here. And what that'll do is this grass will break down over time and amend the soil here with high nitrogen, especially these grass clippings. And that's what my muscadines need, especially in the growing season. And they benefit from that. So I don't have to really do a whole lot of finding some way to bag up my soil or my grass clippings, take them to the curb. I can recycle and harvest my lawn, and all that material comes in real handy, especially for feeding my muscadine grapes. So I asked some folks, what questions about compost do you have? And I got some responses in my community tab, so thank you. Heather asked me, when do you turn your compost and how do you know when it's ready? Good question. Turning your compost really depends on the nature of your pile. And so that's why I have a compost thermometer like this one. It's real long and it sticks down in there. And you can see I've got a pretty good burn going. It's up into the, it's about 140 right now. But when I start to see that temperature drop off and I see a decline and it gets below about 100 degrees, then I'll turn it again, because that tells me the bacteria in there have done their job and are starting to decline, and it needs oxygen or it needs water. So turn your compost, fork it around. If you have a tumbler, rotate it a few times, spray it down with water, and the turning adds oxygen, aeration to your compost pile, and that bacteria can get going again. So if you don't have a thermometer, I strongly suggest you get one. But if you don't have one, turn it when you start to feel no more warmth down in the middle of that pile. You know, open up a channel, stick your hand down in there and see if there's any warmth. And if it's cold, if it's cool, then you need to turn that and water it. How do you know when it's done? Well, when it looks like the stuff you buy in the store. When it's dark brown, when it's rich, when it looks like coffee grounds. Yeah, when it looks like earth, when it looks like humus. Amber asked about composting inside chicken coops. I don't know. I don't have chickens. My son has a ton of chickens, and there's no way you could compost with those chickens. They would destroy the compost pile and spread it everywhere. I would take what's in the chicken coop and put it in a protected compost pile. Same thing, I don't know about greenhouses. I don't have one, so yeah, you could compost in a greenhouse easily. It might be a source of warmth and heat for you. How important is the combination of types of things to put in? I think we may have covered that already, but if not, go check out my compost video. I answer all those questions there. I just try to keep a mix going. I'm not real religious about it. I know that if you get a mixture of browns and grains, nitrogens and carbons, you're going to get compost. It might take a little longer if you're imbalanced to one side or the other, but to me it doesn't really matter. I just put everything in there and let nature sort it out. The smallest size compost you can make, I've said before, I know someone who composts in a 5-gallon bucket on her apartment balcony. You can do that, but the larger the pile you can get, the more compost you're going to get, because compost, the material you put in, the bulk of that material breaks down to about, man, even 5% or 10% of the actual mass of what you put in is what you're going to get out. So the larger the better. Cover or not during the winter? That's a good question. I like to cover mine when there's going to be a whole lot of rain. I don't cover it in the winter because the heat from the compost is coming from the bacteria inside, and those bacteria are insulated down in the middle of your pile. So I don't bother covering it. Some people do. If you're going to have an icy, frozen winter, you might want to cover it. Everything that I've learned about composting in the last couple of years has come from my friend David the Good, and David has written this book, Compost Everything, and I'm going to plug it for him. David's a good gardener. Obviously, he's David the Good, but go follow David the Good's channel. Check him out on YouTube, and also you can read his website, thesurvivalgardener.com. David has taught me a lot about composting, especially the anaerobic stuff. So I'm going to plug his book. I consider him a friend. I consider him a fellow gardener who's doing all the good stuff. And yeah, you should follow him too. So there's a bit about compost. I hope that you've been inspired to try composting even in the winter. If you've never composted before, it's pretty easy. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And happy gardening to you. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.